Hello, I'm Jovan Johnson with the IMF Tracker. This week, Monitoring Committee says government exceeds targets under the IMF program. Tourism incentives to get cut, and Bruce Golding says it's not enough to be IMF compliant. These stories in a moment, but first, our question of the week. In economics, what is a weak sister? Stay tuned, the answer comes up at the end of the program. A committee monitoring Jamaica's program with the IMF says the government has met and in some cases surpassed all the key targets for the July to September quarter. The Economic Program Oversight Committee reported on Tuesday that both the primary balance and net international reserves have exceeded their targets. Co-chairman of the Oversight Committee, Richard Ball, says the latest update suggests that the management of Jamaica's finances is improving. He says much of the government's savings came partly from a lower volume of oil imports as well as a general reduction in imports. An IMF team is expected in the island shortly to conduct a review of the July to September quarter. Beneficiaries of fiscal incentives in the tourism industry will be required to pay the full rate of General Consumption Tax (GCT) on revenue if they do not terminate those entitlements before July 1 next year. Currently, the applicable rate of GCT on revenue in the tourism sector is 10%. The new measures are contained in the Fiscal Incentives Bill tabled in Parliament last week. The bill notes that the continuing beneficiary will instead be liable to pay GCT at the standard rate of 16.5%. The fiscal incentives legislation is scheduled to take effect on January 1 and forms part of the omnibus incentive legislation agreed to as a structural benchmark of Jamaica's program with the IMF. Those electing to terminate the entitlement must do so in writing to the Commissioner General of Tax Administration. Former Prime Minister Bruce Golding says it is not enough to be IMF compliant without countering the negative implications from implementing structural reforms. Speaking at a U.S. lecture recently, Mr. Golding said if the conditions imposed by the IMF are left to themselves, they will become impediments to investment and genuine economic growth. Mr. Golding insisted that his comments were not criticisms of the PNP administration given the limited choices available, or the IMF, whose mandate is to maintain financial stability. Mr. Golding said given that the IMF program addresses macroeconomic constraints, the government must move to tackle limitations in the real economy. And to end our program, the answer to this week's question. A weak sister is an element that undermines the entire system. Weak sister can either refer to a single individual or a specialized group considered to be the weak link in an integrated process. And that's where we end our trek this week on the IMF Tracker. I'm Jovan Johnson.